Hi, my name is Samantha Robinson, and I will be presenting my case study about Jim Jones. To start off, the article that I used to base my case study on was Jim Jones, a case study in the relationship between antisocial and narcissistic personality disorders by Taylor Martin. She created this in the spring of 2019, so it's fairly recent. As for the demographics of this character, his name is James Warren Jones, but we best refer him to or best know him as Jim Jones. He was born May 13th, 1931. His age is 47 at the time of death, and his occupation is a cult leader of the People's Temple. Before I get into a bit of his psychological evaluations, I wanted to give a couple background informations. He was born in Crete, Indiana, to James Thurman Jones and Lynetta Putnam. His father, James Thurman, was a disabled World War I veteran. He couldn't hold a job, and he was considered an alcoholic by locals. As for his mother, she was considered unstable when it came to social cues and just her mental state as a whole. She set very high standards for her son, even though she didn't put any effort into teaching him how to fulfill them or attain these standards. She proudly claimed to have visions when pregnant with her son of her deceased mother telling her how great of a man he would be. Later, the Great Depression affected the Jones family and forced them to move to Lynn, Indiana, where Jim spent his childhood in his shack with no plumbing. Jones basically raised himself as his mother was working all the time and his father had little interest in him. His parents weren't very religious people, but he still went to church often as a child with his neighbors. The author's choice of theory was the categorical approach. They found this approach in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and they used this manual's method for diagnosing personality disorders, and applied this to Jim Jones. So before I truly find information comparisons on his mental health and the criteria that his mental health has fit in regards to antisocial and narcissistic personality disorders, I feel like it's very important to go over a bit of the history he's had as a leader in his church. I feel like this information is very important when it comes to evaluating his mental health. So I'm going to start off with the People's Temple. It was an American new religious movement from 1955 to 1974. Jones began working as a self-ordained Christian minister until he raised enough money to start this church in 1955. He initially preached about economic and social equality for people of all races. This appealed to a large group of people at the time who felt that the U.S. government wasn't doing enough for its citizens. So to continue this, to gain publicity and more devotion from his followers, Jones faked an assassination attempt by shooting at the front of his house. By doing this, he gave his congregation a faceless enemy. And I feel like the best way to really achieve the devotion and gain the power that he really wanted to was to give his followers a mutual enemy. Jones used manipulative tactics to gain more members. He enticed religious people and socialist sympathizers by using biblical metaphors to attack the U.S. government system. He also convinced his followers that failing to follow every instruction he gave could result in punishment as serious as death. He did so after the passing of one of his followers after a car crash. He told his followers at the time that he told the deceased member to meditate 2 minutes before getting into their vehicle, and and apparently he claimed that they had not done so, and by ignoring his instructions, it had caused the car accident that eventually took their life. So, to start off with Jones' mental downfall, he claimed he was the reincarnation of historical figures like Jesus, Gandhi, and Karl Marx, which right off the bat is kind of a symbol of instability and an egotistical identity. He would use his power as a trusted church official to take advantage of his members, both mentally and physically. I mean, he justified cheating on his wife with a member of the church because he had to have sex to retain his spiritual powers. He also raped members such as Deborah Layton, and manipulated them into thinking that he was doing it for them. Though he prohibited openly gay relationships in his following, he took part in casual sex with men, so far that he convinced male members to have sex with him. And when Marsland wanted to leave Jones, he tried to intimidate her with spiritual retribution. And when he discovered that this method wouldn't work on her, he basically threatened to kill her in front of her kids. Continuing on his downfall, he elevated himself by solidifying himself to his people as a god figure, and the focus of their religious movement over the god that people had found comfort in up until that moment. He also started using amphetamines. He covered up the symptoms of using these drugs, like red eyes, puffy eyes, by telling his followers he had reached a state so holy that if he looked at anyone with his unshielded eyes, they would burst into flame. Basically as an excuse to wear sunglasses to avoid people making assumptions. The drugs worsened Jones' paranoia, and he continued to paint the government as a force that threatened his movement. He basically orchestrated another failed assassination attempt to justify his paranoia to his followers. The second attempt convinced his followers to leave the country. He also convinced his followers to leave the country by convincing them that the government was planning to put American black people into concentration camps. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Jonestown Massacre. I feel like we are all very familiar with, but I do want to break it down a bit further. He began taking groups of people of his followers to Guyana to develop his own promised land and labeled this promised land as Jonestown. Jones started to address his congregation a lot angrier and was a lot less coherent, and gave punishments escalating in a similar manner. He also considered the most forbidden act was to talk about leaving the commune. You would be punished severely for having these kind of conversations, and it was also nearly impossible at that point for members to leave because Jones had such a hand in their own personal matters, whether it be finances, anything that would be important in relation to individuals that they would like to keep safe. He began drawing up plans of mass suicide when he agreed to let Congressman Leo Ryan visit. During Ryan's stay, a man tried passing him a note for help, and he was caught. The night of Ryan's stay, a handful of members escaped into the jungle, and even more were able to leave Jonestown, which was the forbidden act. He sent a group of armed loyalists to kill Ryan after members tried escaping, which proved unsuccessful. Despite it being unsuccessful, Jones told his followers that they had killed him, and that because of what they did, the U.S. government was going to come for them next, and he claimed that they would torture everyone. He was quoted saying, "If we can't live in peace, we must die in peace." And after stating this, he basically forced vats of punch or Kool-Aid laced with cyanide and shared it with all of the church members. The children were targeted first because they were the easiest to convince to drink the punch, and many chose to drink the poison after seeing their dead relatives and feeling the hopelessness of the situation. Jim Jones himself died from a gunshot wound to the head. Annie, the woman who shot Jones and the last member to die, left a suicide note. Even in death, she, like many other members, believed Jones to be innocent in this tragedy. She blamed the U.S. government, claiming that they had died because the U.S. government, would not let us live. In total, this tragedy caused the death of 909 individuals. Before I officially break down Jim Jones's relation to antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, I just wanted to briefly go over the criteria. This comes directly from the DSM-5, which is what the author is trying to reference in their article or in their case study. So basically, when it comes to the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, significant impairments in personality functioning are the impairment in self-functioning and interpersonal functioning. In regards to self-functioning, it's flaws in identity and self-direction. These flaws would be having a large ego, having a self-esteem that's completely derived from personal gain and power. When it came to self-direction, these goals that a person may have, an individual suffering from antisocial personality disorder may have, are based off of personal gratification, and they also have a failure to conform to lawful or cultural norms and ethical behavior. As for the impairments of interpersonal functioning, this regards to empathy and intimacy. Someone struggling from this disorder would have a lack of concern for feelings and needs of others, and a lack of remorse. For if they may hurt somebody, they would not feel any guilt. And they also have trouble with intimacy. They're incapable of having mutually intimate relationships. Most often, they exploit the relationships and use them as a means of getting something that they want or manipulating a person into doing something that they want as an act of dominance or intimidation. They just want to basically control the other person. The next thing that is important for the criteria to this disorder is pathological personality traits, which is antagonism and disinhibition. In antagonism, it's manipulativeness, deceitfulness, callousness, hostility, and for manipulative, it's a frequent influence of control of others using charm, gullibility, seduction to achieve one's ends at all costs. Deceitfulness is basically just dishonesty and somebody misrepresenting themselves or fabricating a set of lies to get what they want. Callousness is basically similar to empathy and the lack of concern for the feelings or problems of others. There's a lack of guilt and remorse about any actions that they may do to somebody else, and there's a tendency of aggression and sadism. For hostility, it's just a persistent and frequent feeling of anger and irritation in response to minor situations, so it's just a very short temper. As for inhibition. This is basically irresponsibility, impulsivity, and risk-taking. So irresponsibility, there's just disregard for financial and other obligations and commitments. And also a lack of taking, or inability to take agreements and promises seriously. Impulsivity, it just acting in a spur of the moment kind of response. They just do actions with very minimal thought behind them. As for risk-taking, it's just engaging in dangerous and risky behavior, potentially damaging themselves or other people, usually due to boredom. And I believe that Jones fits this criteria in a variety of ways, one of these being lying, deception, and manipulation for profit or self-amusement. Even in his closest relationships, Jones was always very deceptive and manipulative. For example, he deceived his wife about his religious beliefs from the beginning of their relationship. And his entire religious following was completely built off of deception at one point. His followers were manipulated into giving him everything that they had, and following Jones's every command. He constantly lied to them about the threats they were facing to solidify his social control, giving them this idea of a mutual enemy, which was the U.S. government, so that they could put more trust and devotion into him, allowing him to get the power that he really wanted. And this shows a lack of empathy, shows manipulation and dishonesty. Another thing he did to fit this criteria, he viewed himself as a messiah of sorts. He convinced his followers to worship him as this god-like leader and persuaded them to believe he had spiritual abilities. He genuinely believed he was Jesus reincarnated and wanted his followers to trust that belief as well. And this shows an egocentric perception to his identity. He further fits into this through irritability and aggression. He was rarely ever personally involved in physical fights, but he was known for forcing cult members to publicly fight each other as a punishment. He was also very irritable, and he would often be very verbally aggressive towards his cult members, especially closer to the end of the People's Temple. This shows callousness, aggression, and hostility. Another thing that Jones did to fit this criteria was the blatant disregard for the safety of himself and others. Jones' plan of ending his cult in a mass suicide event is pretty much the ultimate display of a disregard for the safety of oneself and others. As for smaller occurrences of behavior, it could be the punishments he inflicted on his cult members. In one instance, I had an example where a woman that was had paralyzing fear of snakes, was forced to let a boa constrictor crawl over her. This clearly shows that he had no regard for her mental well-being, her safety. He just wanted to teach her a lesson. And I believe that this shows a further lack of empathy, impulsiveness, and a sense of risk-taking. As for the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, it's very similar to the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. It had the same impairments of self-functioning and interpersonal functioning criteria of same thing about identity and self-direction, empathy and intimacy. There was a little bit of difference when it came to the pathological personality traits of antagonism. This was basically characterized by grandiosity, which is a feeling of entitlement, either overt or covert. There's a self-centeredness to this, and a firm belief that one holds that they're better than others, and often condescending because of this belief. There's also an attention-seeking aspect, where there's just excessive attempts to attract the focus of the attention of others. How he fit this criteria, he did require excessive admiration. Members of the People's Temple were publicly shamed and at times physically punished for contradicting or questioning Jones and his ideals. He was intent on appearing just like all-powerful, all-knowing. This shows the grandiosity that the criteria spoke about and self-entitlement. He was also preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance. He did this through his devotion of creating this ideal version of socialist society with himself as a leader, populated by individuals who saw him as a god. His unceasing attempts to increase his power by gathering more followers and extending his political influence eventually did cause his downfall. It showed just how far he was willing to go to achieve this sense of power. He was willing to risk everything that he had for it, and eventually that is what he did. So in conclusion, the author presents a very detailed case about Jim Jones suffering from both narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Due to a starting a life of deception when he met his wife, lying to her both about his religion and about his part in the community, especially in acts of charity that he claimed to do when he first met her. And due to the complicated situation he grew up in with a socially inept mother and a drunkard father, as well as a life of poverty, he did find himself falling into a life of lies and a need for power and loyalty because of the instability that he had faced throughout all of his life. He gained a following through this identity that he created for himself, which did eventually end up being his undoing. His inability to accept failure and admit he was wrong led him to his death and the death of 909 people as well. So